Hi, welcome to this episode of Faith and Logic. In this episode of Faith and Logic, we are going to look at how Herod the Great and his family is the backdrop of Gospels and the book of Acts. So let's just begin with Herod the Great and the Herodian dynasty. And we are going to look at Gospels and the book of Acts to see how they are the backdrop of the Gospels and the book of Acts. Let's just look at the background of Herod the Great. He had an Idumean father, Antipater, and a Nabatean mother, Cypros. He rose to power through Roman support, primarily Antony and Octavian. He declared himself to be the king of the Jews in 40 BC. He was known for his paranoia and executions. He built massive building projects, including the Herod's Temple. We are going to look at some of the pictures in this presentation. Let's just look at Herod the man. In the scheme of Christmas story, we normally read about Herod the Great. Herod represents the majority. Herod was insecure and jealous. Since he was treacherous, he expected treachery. When we read the Christmas story in the book of Matthew, we see that Herod the Great, who is the king at the time of Jesus' birth, now when he heard that there is another king of the Jews who is born, he was insecure, he was jealous, he was paranoid. So he could not stand any other king other than himself. That is the reason he orders all the male child 2 years and under to be killed. So Herod's rise to power. In 47 BC, Herod appointed the governor of Galilee. In 40 BC, he was given Palestine by Senate. He assisted Mark Antony at Samosata. In 37 BC, he besieged Jerusalem. Initially, Herod supported Mark Antony. After Octavian defeats Antony, Herod sides with Octavian. So he sides with whoever is in the power. So when Octavian became emperor, Herod the Great sided with Octavian. Now, Herod's mania, as we saw earlier, he was paranoid. So Herod had around 10 wives simultaneously. He executes his enemies, as we read in the history. He was paranoid tyrant who runs from Cleopatra. He divorces his wives, imprisons his own sons. He had his own wife killed. He dies in 4 BC in Jericho, according to the secular history. So we see that how paranoid he was. And the reason why he ordered all the male child 2 years and under to be killed, we can see from the backdrop here that he was paranoid and he was jealous. He couldn't stand anyone else to be the king of the Jews other than himself. We can see in the book of Matthew, chapter 2, two kings. One is Herod the Great, and one is Jesus Christ, who is the true king. Let's look further. His treachery, as we read in Matthew 2:16. Then when Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he became very enraged and sent and slew all the male children who were in Bethlehem and all its vicinity from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the Magi. Let's look at the Herod's family tree. So here we see that Herod the Great, he died in around 4 BC. He had several wives, around 10 wives at different period of time. From his wife Doris, he has Antipater. The sons of Mariamma, they are Aristobulus and Alexander. Now we see Herodias. She became the wife of Herod Philip the First. So Philip the First was Herod's another son through his wife Mariamma of Simon, and he married to Herodias. Later he divorced Herodias and she marries to Herod Antipas. And Herod Antipas is one of the Herod's son that we see mostly in the Gospels. Then Archelaus, we see in the Matthew about Archelaus. And then his another son of Cleopatra is Herod Philip II. He was the tetrarch. He died around AD 34. And then we see the great grandson of Herod the Great is Herod Agrippa II. He reigned longest. His sister Bernice, we see her also in the book of Acts, and Drusilla. So here we see the Herodian family tree. and all the sons of Herod the Great. So let's just look at some more details about Herod the Great. He was the king at Jesus' birth. He reigned around 37 to 4 BC. His territories were Judea, Idumea, Samaria, Galilee, Perea. He ruled as a client king under Rome. We see his role in Matthew chapter 2, the slaughter of the innocent. Herod is portrayed as paranoid, as we see ruthless ruler who sees birth of Jesus as a political threat. Matthew uses Herod to parallel Pharaoh, what he did in Exodus 1. He also orders all male child to be killed, showing Jesus as the true deliverer. Now, backdrop of messianic expectations, Herod's massive building projects, as we are going to see. He built several fortresses and important structures around Judea. His cruelty and his paranoia, he executed his own sons, his wife Mariamma, highlights a dark, oppressive time into which Jesus was born. In Matthew 2, verses 1 and 2, we see the mention of Herod the Great. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, it is very important that we identify whenever gospel mentions about Herod, which Herod the gospel is talking about. So here it is talking about Herod the Great. We see him in Matthew chapter 2, but after that, we don't see him. Mostly we see Herod Antipas. So that is an important thing to remember. And a Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who is been born, King of the Jews? For we saw his star in east and have come to worship him." Also in Luke chapter 1 and verse 5, in the time of Herod, king of Judea. So here it is talking about Herod the Great. And we can see how Luke gives every detail. He's writing his gospel. A historian writes a history. So he will mention who was the king, who was the emperor, who was the high priest, who was the governor. So that's the style of Luke's writing. Now in Matthew chapter 2, verse 19 to 23, it says in verse 19, "But when Herod died," so this is the death of Herod the Great. And after this, we do not see him. We see Archelaus after his death. He reigned in Judea, but when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod. So Archelaus is the son of Herod the Great, and he reigned for the short time after the death of Herod. Now, in Luke chapter 3, verse 1, we see in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. So, see how Luke is writing his gospel. He is mentioning who was the emperor. Tiberius Caesar is the emperor. Pontius Pilate was the governor. Herod, the tetrarch of Galilee. So, he mentions the tetrarch of Galilee, that is Herod Antipas. His brother Philip, the tetrarch. We saw in the Herod's family tree about Philip, the tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis. So here we see after the death of Herod the Great, his sons, Herod the tetrarch, that is Herod the Antipas, and his brother Philip, he was the tetrarch. Now let's look at Herod's building project. So Herod, he's known for the building construction of the temple, which was in Jerusalem. He did the expansion of the temple in Jerusalem. So the project began sometime in 22 BC to 20 BC. He enlarged the temple platform to the double of its size. We know the temple which was built by Solomon. Later it was destroyed. During the time of Zerubbabel, it was rebuilt. So Herod, he basically remodeled that temple. Here is a small history. Accordingly, in the 15th year of his reign, Herod rebuilt the temple, surrounded a piece of land about it with a wall. So he basically expanded that original temple, and he did it to please the Jews. He also built Caesarea Maritima. This was a major Roman city, a port city. It was a harbor. He built amphitheater, palace. He named to honor Caesar Augustus. This is about Herod remodeling the temple, which was rebuilt at the time of Zerubbabel, the second temple. Now, this is the replica of the temple, which was originally built by Solomon. This is the western wall. We see Jews, they pray. That's the western wall. That's the only wall which is remaining. Now, this is the port that he built. He named it after Augustus Caesar. Caesarea Maritime. This was a harbor that he built. Herod the Great, he was a great architect, so he built this harbor. He built Masada. It was a mountain fortress. Here is the Masada. This was a fortress that was built by Herod. He built Herodium. It was an artificial mountain fortress. So here is the Herodium, very difficult to breach. He built Jericho palaces. He built a theater, amphitheater in Jerusalem. We can see this is the modern picture. This still exists today. This was built by Herod the Great. So, as we can see, he was a great architect and he built several of these monuments during his time. Now, Herod's kingdom after his death was divided among his sons. They were called tetrarchs after 4 BC. So, upon Herod's death, Rome divided his kingdom among 3 surviving sons. These Herods appear throughout the Gospel and the book of Acts. As we have seen in Matthew, after his death, his son Archelaus, he had a short reign between 4 BC to 86. His territory was Judea, Samaria, Idumea. He is mentioned in Matthew chapter 2, verse 22. Joseph fears returning to Judea because Archelaus was as cruel as his father. This fear causes the family to settle in Nazareth, fulfilling the prophecy. Historically, Archelaus was removed by Rome for brutality, leading to direct Roman prefects like Pontius Pilate. Now, after the mention of Archelaus in Matthew, we see Herod the Antipas, and he is the one who was there at the time of crucifixion of Jesus. And most part of the gospel mentions about Herod Antipas. When it says Herod, it is Herod Antipas. He ruled between 4 BC to AD 39. His territory were Galilee and Perea. He is mentioned in Gospels. He was the ruler over Galilee, where Jesus grew up. He executed John the Baptist, as we read in Mark chapter 6, Matthew chapter 14. He was a threat to Jesus. Jesus calls him fox. Pharisees warned Jesus that Herod wants to kill you, as we read in Luke chapter 13. He was there at the trial of Jesus, as we read in the Gospels. Pilate sent Jesus to Herod Antipas. Herod mocks Jesus but finds no guilt. And later we see that it was Pilate who gave the crucifixion order, as Jews could not give death penalty to the criminal. Now, in Matthew chapter 14, verse 1 to 5, we read about Herod Antipas and Herod Philip. At the time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the news about Jesus and said to his servant, "This is John the Baptist. He has risen from the dead. That is why miraculous powers are at work in him." For when Herod had John arrested, he bound him and put him in the prison because of Herodias. Now, we saw about Herodias in the family tree of Herod. She was one of the Herod's daughter, and she was also a wife of his brother Philip. And that was the reason that John the Baptist was behind Herod Antipas, because she divorced Herod Philip and she married to Antipas. For John had been saying, "It is not lawful for you to have her." Though Herod wanted to put him to death, he feared the crowd because they regarded John as the prophet. In Luke chapter 13, verse 31, 32, we see that just at that time, some Pharisees approached saying to him, "Go away, live here, for Herod wants to kill you." So they warned Jesus that Herod Antipas, he wants to kill him. And then Jesus referred to him as fox. He said, "Go and tell that fox, behold, I cast out demons and perform cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I reach my goal." In Acts chapter 4, verse 27, it says, "For truly in this city there were gathered together against you holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, but Herod and Pontius Pilate." So here the Herod is Herod Antipas. Now, we read about Herod Philip, as we have seen some of the scriptures which mentions about Herod Philip. He reigned between 4 BC to AD 34. He was mentioned in Luke chapter 3, verse 1. Yes, we also seen about her, Herod Philip's former wife, later married to Herod Antipas. She's mentioned in Mark chapter 6 and Matthew chapter 14. She's central to John the Baptist's opposition to Antipas. That was the reason John the Baptist was opposing Antipas, telling him that it's not lawful for you to marry her, ask for John's head through her daughter's dance. We read about this in the Gospels. Now, Herodian dynasty in Acts, we see their dynasty continued in the book of Acts. We read about Herod Agrippa the first. He was the grandson of Herod the Great. He reigned between AD 36 to around 43-44 AD. He's mentioned in the book of Acts, chapter 12. We see he was persecution of the early church, his role. He executes James, the son of Zebedee. We read about that in Acts chapter 12. He imprisons Peter, intending to kill him. Herod's pride and death. He accepted worship as a god at Caesarea, struck down by angel, and he dies. We read that in the book of Acts chapter 12. Now, Acts chapter 12, verse 2 and 3, it talks about Herod Agrippa I, and he, Herod Agrippa I, killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. In Acts chapter 12, verse 21, we see on an appointed day, Herod, having put on his royal apparel, took his seat on the rostrum and began delivering an address to them. So this is Herod Agrippa I. When it says Herod here, this is Herod Agrippa I, the grandson of Herod the Great. Acts 13:1. Now there were at Antioch in the church that was there prophets and teachers, Barnabas and Simeon, who was called Niger, and Lucius of Cyrene, and Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch. So when it says Herod the Tetrarch here, he's talking about Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great. So it's very important that when it talks about Herod the Tetrarch, you identify which Herod the Gospels and the Acts is talking about. Now, we read about Herod Agrippa II, the great grandson as well, in the book of Acts, chapters 25-26. He had the longest reign. He reigned between AD 44 to 100. He hears Paul's defense alongside his sister Bernice. Agrippa II listens to Paul's testimony. He replies back very famously. He said, "Almost you persuaded me to be Christian." Acts as a political advisor to Festus. His presence shows the legal and political complexity surrounding Paul's trial. So as we read in Acts chapter 25, verse 13 and 14, a few days later, King Agrippa, so that is Agrippa II, arrived with his sister Bernice, so she's also mentioned here, to pay their respect to Festus. And in Acts chapter 26, verse 32, then said Agrippa unto Festus, so this is Agrippa II, the great grandson of Herod the Great. This man might have been set at liberty, but if he had not appealed unto Caesar. So here is the summary of the Herodian rulers. Herod the Great, the son of Antipater. Herod Archelaus, after the death of Herod the Great, he comes to the power. We read about him in Matthew 2:22. Then Herod Philip, another son of Herod the Great. Then Herod Antipas, he is the Herod that we read about the most in the Gospels. He was the tetrarch at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. Then we read about Herod Agrippa I in Acts chapter 12, the grandson of Herod the Great. And then we read about Herod Agrippa II. He is the great grandson of Herod the Great. So we read about him in Acts chapter 25 and 26. So I hope this episode has helped you understanding the role of Herod the Great and his family as a backdrop of Gospels and the book of Acts. This also shows that how accurate the Gospel of Luke is and how accurately the Gospel writers are writing. They are writing these Gospels as history, especially Luke, when he talks about the emperor, who was the emperor, who was the tetrarch, who was the king, who was the governor at that particular time during the ministry of Jesus. So I hope this episode has helped you understanding about the family of Herod and how he is the backdrop of gospel and the book of Acts, especially the Christmas story. Thank you and God bless.